Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Inferno's Edge by Bear64. Hope not ever to see heaven. I have come to lead you to the other shore, into eternal darkness, into fire, and into ice. Dante Alighieri, Inferno. Glenn had been choking on the smoky haze for a week, and the orange glow had gone from being visible only at night to providing what appeared to be a constant sunrise for the hellscape that now approached to just over the next ridge from his home. Laura and the kids had evacuated to the city to stay with her parents 2 years earlier, long before the fire threatened. Their lives had been torn asunder by personal forces and internal pressures rather than by the harsh realities of nature. This home was all he had left, the place where he was still able to spend at least some limited time with his children, at least until the fires had begun a couple of months past. Now the conflagration that had devoured so much threatened his home and his life. He knew in his guts that it would come towards him. Animals had fled ahead of it for days, frightened, wild-eyed, many of them injured or scorched. They fled together, predator and prey alike, running side by side with no thought of enmity, only of terror, and of all the all-consuming flames that pursued them with no regard for status or value. The animals ran aimlessly, only their instincts for survival engaged. The humans ran towards various goals, places of what they considered safety, their vehicles piled high with whatever they thought of as necessity. The area had formerly been micro-ranches and mini-farms, mostly owned by those who could afford to escape the madness that had reigned in the cities for the past few years. It was all burning these days, urban, suburban, rural. There was nowhere to run, to truly escape, not for him, nor for anyone else. He wore a painter's mask that did little to stop the smoke, but gave him some psychological comfort. He had taken to carrying his home defense rifle on his forays outdoors. A deer had wandered near the pool they'd installed for the kids during their "let's buy stuff to repair our broken marriage" phase. The deer's hide had emitted smoke, and there was horrible, searing patches of flesh missing from the unfortunate creature's flanks and backs. It had uttered something like a scream when it leapt into the pool and doused the last of the heat. Whether it bellowed in relief or in further agony from the pool chemicals, he was unsure. He had half coaxed, half frightened the poor animal out of the water, and then placed several rounds into it to end the suffering. He was no hunter, but he tried to butcher the carcass in some misplaced need to remain altruistic about the killing by eating the flesh. Yet he'd butchered the process more than the body. Eventually he gave it up, and several wild coyote dogs and a brown bear removed it from his consideration. For some reason, perhaps due to the proximity of the pool water, they had calmed enough to eat before they resumed their flight. Other instincts had risen in them for long-term survival. Since then, he'd had a nightmare about various forest creatures running towards him, invariably with hair and fur or feathers and scales aflame. They screamed with human voices and cried out for him to save them. He tried. He fired his dream rifle that never required reloading, like that of some old-time Western movie picture or TV hero. Each of the animals would explode into ashes with the same scream as the dying buck. Their eyes invariably glowed yellow and orange, as though the fire had already taken their souls. The sound would grow louder, and the lights from their eyes would grow brighter and more intense until he would explode from his sleep state, drenched in sweat and craving water. He napped often. The power was out, and it was hot to a point that he had almost as much trouble breathing inside the house as outside. Even night did little to alleviate the misery. Now he awakened with the horror fresh and the thirst burning, and made his way to the kitchen, where he put his glass under the faucet and lifted the handle. A few drops fell, and the pipes groaned and hissed, yet nothing else spilled forth. No water! His mind shouted at him. He had plenty stored around the house, but the instinctual shock awakened him from his stupor, induced by stress, fatigue, and a lack of clean oxygen, all mixed with a profound sadness for the loss of the world around him. For 2 days the smoke had increased, and the glow above the ridge intensified, yet now it shifted, more to the west and maybe south. The winds had grown more fierce and hotter than those in the perdition of which his paternal grandparents had spoken, had used to frighten him and his siblings. The breath of Satan will sear the moisture from your flesh, and the hot wind of its passing will turn all to ash, his grandfather had screeched from his pulpit. Glenn shuddered. He now knew that, regardless of the source, a version of the Christian Islamic flames of hell resided all too near to his earthly abode and goods. Still, a glimmer of hope that it would pass lingered. How not? It was part of the human ability to survive, to hope when all was clearly lost. He looked up as he approached the little golf cart, now stalled for all eternity, and saw that the girl had left it and currently walked dejectedly, eyes on the ground, greasy locks wrapped around her face, along the side of the road in the same direction he was headed. A wicked smile of satisfied judgment spread over his features, and he was tempted to roll down the window, honk and scream, "Serves you right, whore." He didn't. She was beaten and bereft of company and the protection of numbers. His remaining decency and human compassion had not entirely fled. Instead, he slowed to a halt and uttered, "Crap, why help this dirty little creep?" He pounded the steering wheel as he berated himself. Then he mumbled, "She'd as soon cut my throat as accept a peaceable offer of a ride. I won't take her far, just to the first group of authorities. She definitely can't be around my kiddos. Probably will want some of my water." When he stopped and waited, he watched her cautiously in the rearview mirror. It took a moment for her to realize that he'd stopped for her. She stood and stared, a little shell-shocked apparently, then walked towards the driver's side of the cab, where she stopped and gazed up at him. I didn't want to kill you or anybody," she added hastily. "It's just like I didn't know what to do, how to, survive. I don't got no weapons or nothing. I just don't know what to do now, Glenn watched her features for signs of deception or scheming. There was only a shocked, vacant look, covered in part by smears of grime. "Well, you can help me find my kids, but have to stop saying 'like' every third word, or so help me. I will leave you on this street to starve." She looked up at him, mouth agape, and then worked a little. Okay." She ran around the front of the truck and climbed into the front passenger seat. Glenn looked at her. "I haven't been to the city in a while. I'm sure it looks different after the fires and looting. Maybe you can help me navigate. My name's Glenn." "Stacy," was her singular reply. He'd probably offended and or frightened her. Not intentionally, but he didn't suffer fools well. That's why he'd moved to the countryside. He also didn't like people who ran around with gang trash, laying in ambush. Still, She had likely just been scooped up by the group. She didn't appear to be streetwise, unless she was a really good con artist. We're headed to Fox Meadow Apartments. You ever heard of that? Know where it is? He hoped to get her out of her fugue and thinking again. Perhaps simple questions would help. Stacy shook her head. I'm not from this area. I grew up on the south side of the city. Not too terrible, but not really a nice place either. As she spoke, she stared out the window at the devastated landscape that now rolled by at a rapid pace. Them guys picked me up from the side of the road. I was walking out this way. Didn't have no place to go after the riots. They burned everything, even my poor granny's house. I was gone, out looking for food, and when I got back, she was gone. And the house was just a pile of ashes. Even her cats. She choked off a little sob. Glenn hoped that the tears were real. It would mean that the girl was human and not just some creature reduced to savagery by hunger and desperation. She cleared her throat. I didn't know where to look for her, but I knew she had a sister out this way, so I started walking. Them guys, they offered me a ride. One of them kept hefting his gun, so I knew they weren't asking. She glanced over at Glenn. He wondered if she was gauging whether her words were having the desired effect. Probably thinks I'm a sucker, he thought sarcastically. Her story sounds like so much BS. They were grabby and pawed at me, but they were in a hurry to get away from the city, so they didn't press for other stuff. They had pissed off some gang that was a gang before and had, real guns and stuff. They knew they were toast if they stayed. She shrugged. We ran out of gas during the rain and had to walk the last few miles. Had a fight with those people when the rain and fire caused a bunch of fog. Everyone felt kind of freaky, so we backed off and stayed in the next house down and came back to finish it today. You saw the rest. She bent her head towards the floorboard. All that to get out of here. And now you're taking me back to where I started. Glenn slowed and pulled over to the side of the road. When he'd come to a full stop, he put the transmission in park and looked over at his passenger. You can get out any time you like. Unlike you and your friends, I don't kidnap people, and I don't have ulterior motives. So quote, this raven. I will resist the urge to torture you with the earworm the character Stacy put in my head. But a little bear lair is always good. And definitely a good start to the week, even if it's Tuesday.